Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the webinar today. Today we're going to be debating whether the COP meetings are an effective way of achieving climate action. This session is hosted by the CIWEM Early Careers Network and Climate Change Specialist panel. Before I give more information on the network and the panel, I wanted to confirm how this all works. So there'll be two Slido votes. The first vote will take place before the debate and the second after the debate to see if those in support of the question or against have made a difference to your opinion. The first of our two Slido votes is now live and you can start voting on Slido 7904148. So you can open Slido, type in that code and start voting now if you're ready to do so. We'll go to a live link on that shortly, but before we go live on that, there's just a little bit of housekeeping. So if we could just go to the next slide, please, Chloe. So the webinar event will be recorded today, just for your information. You can see past recordings on our YouTube channel. If you do experience any technical issues today or need any assistance, please use the chat feature in Zoom to let us know what the problem is and how we can help. We will take questions at the end of the event, but please put your questions into the Slido Q&A throughout the session. When asking questions, we do ask that you state who you're asking the question to. Apologies. So to confirm, the Zoom chat is for technical issues only, and the Slido is for the Q&A questions. Hopefully that is clear. As I said, this event is hosted by CIWEM's Early Careers Network with support from the CIWEM Climate Change Specialist panel. The Early Careers Network is a platform for early career professionals to collaborate, share and to network. Members of the network are typically in their first 5 years of their careers and get exclusive opportunities to develop their knowledge and skills alongside other like-minded water and environmental professionals. This is the second webinar they've hosted on the theme of climate action. The first was debating whether the private or public sector has the most important role in delivering climate action. That can be viewed on the CIWEM YouTube channel, so please feel free to go and look at that. You can also sign up to the Early Career Professionals Network newsletter via the CIWEM website and join them via LinkedIn. So the CIWEM Climate Change panel is a panel of specialists engaged in issues relating to climate change. It aims to engage, inform and assist the UN, governments and other bodies on climate change and advocate best practice globally. Let's go straight on now to the COP debate and the theme of today's debate. Ahead of COP28, at the end of this month being held in Dubai, there's ongoing debate about the effectiveness, of course, of the COP meetings and if they can achieve climate action. Advocates of COP say the meetings are a useful tool to assess progress in dealing with climate change and to negotiate and adopt decisions on various aspects of the UNFCCC and its related agreements. However, critics feel that these meetings are more focused on greenwashing than achieving action. Which side is right? So let's go now straight live to the Slido vote to see what you guys' opinions are. Hopefully you've all been voting. And I can see that, we have a very high percentage so far. Slightly too small for me to read. Hold on 1 second. So 53% feel no, there are not an effective way. And 40 or 45 is changing slightly as we go through. We've only got 38 votes there, so hopefully we'll have a few more people joining. Feel free to join on Slido. Just open up Slido, type in the participant code 7904148, and you can vote there. It's just a click button on the poll. While we're just waiting for a few more people to vote, I just wanted to say that we've got two panels here. One arguing with, so there's 6 people in total. 3 are arguing on panel 1 in support of the question, and 3 are arguing against. And I should state that each person has been randomly assigned their arguing position, and that is regardless of their actual individual views. So we've asked them to take a stance which might not be in line with their views. So we're up to about 90 people on that now. So I think let's close the vote there. So actually we have ended at 67% who don't think that they are effective, and 33% who think that they are effective. So without further ado, let's hand over now to the group arguing in support of the question. So the names and the bios are also included on the events page on CIWEM for this debate. If you want to find out more about any of the individuals taking part in the debate today, just go to the website on CIWEM and you can find out a bit more about all of our speakers and panelists today. So let's hand over to panel 1, and we're going to start off with Jess, and she is arguing, this group are arguing, are COP meetings an effective way of achieving climate action?
Thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. So yeah, as Emma said, myself, Linda and Nathan are going to be arguing that COPs are an effective way of delivering climate action. I'll be starting off our argument to say that COPs help to drive consensus. Firstly, the COP meetings are a forum to get people around the table, people from both countries with advanced economies and less advanced economies, to discuss climate change. It is a space where people listen to testimonials from countries that are already being impacted by climate change. Representatives from advanced economies must listen to the emotive and passionate speeches from less advanced economies. For example, the last 2 years, Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, has attacked advanced economies mainly for their lack of action in her no-nonsense speeches. And at the COP meetings, attendees, including heads of states, are forced to sit up and listen and to understand how climate change is already impacting these countries. For example, one thing that Mia Motley said last year is the prosperity and high carbon emissions of the rich world had been achieved at the expense of the poor in times past, and now the poor are being forced to pay again as victims of climate breakdown that they did not cause. So here are one of the few global forums that provide the same status to leaders from less advanced economies like Mia from Barbados as the advanced economies like America. COP is also a meeting to review previous agreements to adopt decisions to further develop and implement measures to mitigate and adapt to climate change. These agreements, which get consensus at COP, are discussed through various negotiation rounds where delegates from participating countries discuss various aspects of climate action. Working groups focus on different aspects of climate action, including the Working Group on the Paris Agreement and the subsidiary body for implementation. And facilitators of mediation are used to bridge differences where parties are unable to reach consensus. The idea of driving consensus at COP comes from the emphasis on transparency and inclusivity at these meetings, which includes many opportunities for various stakeholders, including non-governmental organisations, Indigenous groups, and the private sector, to engage with and provide input where they have the relevant status to do so. This negotiation process relies on consensus building across all those involved, which means that the final decision and text are all agreed by the participating parties, ideally unanimously. This process is complex and requires diplomacy and compromise to find common ground to agree on global climate-related issues, with the goal to ensure that all parties are committed to final decisions and actions, which is essential for effective international climate cooperation. COP27 last year was attended by more than 100 heads of states and over 35,000 participants. The fact that we heavily criticise heads of states who don't attend these COP meetings suggests we think they're important for delivering climate action. As well as this, overall engagement with the COP meetings is growing. The first COP was in 1995, and the average attendance across the first 10 COPs was around 5,000 people, compared to the average total attendance across the last 5 COPs, which has been about 22,000 people. I'd just like to acknowledge here the carbon footprint of the attendees, including the use of private jets, which can be very frustrating. However, it's useful to take a bit of a step back and look at the bigger picture. The actions, pledges, and targets, which have largely come from COP, mean that our future global greenhouse emissions could be limited to about 2 degrees of warming. If you compare this to a situation where there are no climate policies, which may have been the case without COP, the level of warming could be about 4 and 5 degrees. So this is a big difference. I've mentioned that the heads of states that attend COP, but also just to reiterate, there are also representatives from Indigenous communities, other community groups, environmental charities, think tanks, businesses, and faith groups. I also want to recognise that, yes, there are also representatives from the fossil fuel industry, which has quite rightly been heavily criticised, but these people are also involved in implementing the actions agreed at COP to achieve our goals around net zero, so it's useful to have their buy-in when the agreements are being made. However, I just want to recognise that this is definitely not perfect, and of course there are negatives of fossil fuel representation at COP, but we're not trying to argue that COP is a perfect solution to deliver climate action. Where would we be without COP, and would we have achieved any consensus? And as Mia Motley says, we have the collective capacity to transform. Thanks, and I'll just pass over to Linda.
Thanks so much, Jess. So good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk to you about the tools and agreements that are used to deliver climate action orchestrated by the Conference of Parties. So these mechanisms are the international community's instruments to combat climate change, and I would argue are an effective way to address the monumental challenge of our time. However, before I do that, I want to state that when we are assessing the ability of the COP to deliver sustainability goals and climate change objectives, we should do so holistically, assessing how COP fits in with the wider international agreements as well as domestic policy. So standing alongside COP are other international agreements such as the Sustainable Development Goals, which further reinforce global commitment to sustainability. Most nations involved in the COP have implemented domestic or national laws and agreements and initiatives to support the goals and commitments of the COP. And at a strategic scale, that might include the ratification of the Paris Agreement into their own national legal frameworks, making it legally binding at a national level, as well as more specific targets such as emission reductions or biodiversity goals. So we can't really assess the COP as a standalone tool. We have to assess it as it is supported by many other tools. So at the heart of the global response to climate change is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it was considered a monumental achievement in its own right when it was adopted in 1992. And it sets the stage for the vital work carried out by the COP. So now I'm going to talk to you about these tools, starting with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change itself. So it's an international treaty which established the foundation for collective climate action, which at the time was deemed urgent. We needed a platform which got people together on an international basis. And it recognises this urgent need to address climate change. And that recognition alone was an enormous achievement. And when you consider some people still debate whether there's climate change, it does happen. And here we're getting an international community saying, yes, we recognise it. And now we're going to lay the groundwork for more specific and binding agreements to follow, and which have followed. Following that was the Kyoto Protocol. And although it was limited in scope to developed countries, it represented a significant milestone in climate action, and it mandated legally binding emission reduction targets and served as a crucial stepping stone towards these. And these have been implemented in many countries already. Fast forward to 2015, and there was another landmark moment in these agreements. We had the Paris Agreement, which is testament to international cooperation. It set a goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius with an aim for 1.5 degrees and provides a path forwards for all nations. This commitment of 196 countries to this agreement was remarkable, to get 196 people agreeing to it. At the heart of the Paris Agreement were nationally determined contributions. These nationally determined contributions are an individual country's commitments to reducing emissions. And the evidence shows that many countries are taking them seriously, implementing policy measures to meet their targets. And not only that, it gives these countries an opportunity to go and identify data that might help them on their road to sustainability and reducing emissions. And many countries don't even know what their emissions are. So having that initial nationally determined contribution has really been key. And also it allows other countries to see, okay, how is this being interpreted by my neighbours, by a particular country polluting a lot or who may be vulnerable. And so having that all together and having that investigative ability through the nationally determined contributions and those pathways, and everybody having their own, is very important. There are financial mechanisms. However, I'm not going to talk about those. Nathan's going to talk about those after me. And outside of these agreements, there are other tools. We have increasing technology transfer. So the spread of technology has been key in advancing sustainability, such as solar power, which has been spreading rapidly across developing countries, increasing access to clean energy. And this has been tangible, and it's been a positive impact, reducing emissions and promoting sustainability. There's been capacity building, which has helped countries which will be impacted to ensure that they can enhance their resilience to those. And that will help with things like flood risks, and those are real and tangible. There's reporting and review. So regular reviews of the country's progress are promoting transparency and accountability, like the nationally determined contributions. And this international scrutiny has already led to positive changes in some countries' policies and actions. And while the COP itself does lack enforcement powers, there is diplomatic pressure and international security scrutiny, which has compelled countries to align their actions with their commitments. Now, you might wonder why these tools and agreements, despite their successes, are still met with skepticism. And let's address some of those key concerns. So one of them has been the ambition gap. There's a lot of criticism that the targets set in these agreements are not ambitious enough to limit global warming to safe levels. And it may be true that more aggressive action is needed. However, the brilliant thing about the COP is that it's flexible and can change over time, and we have seen those changes occurring over time. At each discussion, there is a little bit of progression. Next, there's enforcement and compliance. It's another concern that these things cannot be enforced. And though the COP cannot impose binding sanctions on countries that do not meet their commitments, there is the power of international scrutiny and diplomacy, and often supporting this is the domestic international policy and laws, which has gone hand in hand because the COP exists. Finally, there's varied commitments. Not all countries have committed the same. They have not been all equally ambitious, and that leads to concerns, which is understandable. However, it's important to recognise that the agreements acknowledge common but differentiated responsibilities, which means that developed countries historically have been the largest emitters. They have a greater obligation to lead in their mitigation efforts, and so you may see an imbalance. In fact, you're likely to. So in conclusion, the tools and agreements from the COP provide an effective way of delivering climate action, but they're not without their challenges. The evidence of their effectiveness is clear. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement represent historic milestones in our fight for climate change. They have brought us all together, they have mobilized nations, they have sparked technological advancements, and they've facilitated the flow of financing to do this. While we must acknowledge the concerns and limitations, we cannot let perfection be the enemy of progress. These agreements serve as a foundation for continued global cooperation, and they allow us to build on past successes to achieve greater sustainability. We must seize the opportunity to address climate change through the COP, and hopefully, yeah, sorry, yeah, sorry, thank you.
Thank you, Jess and Linda. So Jess and Linda has summarised the COP summit's abilities to drive consensus and form treaties. But all too often what we really need to know is where's the money at? To transition to net zero, we need to raise an estimated $4 to $6 trillion a year. And we need to distribute much of that financing from countries in the global north to countries in the global south, who must not be prevented from prosperity by either the effects of climate change or a rush to prevent it. Fortunately, the COP process is moving forwards with financing deals that enable us to do just this. At COP27 even, this included the setting up of a committee to define the terms of a loss and damage fund designed to address the current finance gap, preventing poorer nations from adapting to and mitigating the impacts of climate change. And on Sunday, the committee announced that they had come to a deal concerning the governance of the fund. If agreed at COP28 later this month, the Loss and Damage Fund could raise hundreds of billions of dollars, redistributing money from historically large emitters, such as the UK, to the countries and people most vulnerable to climate change. This would not be possible without the global buy-in and collaboration that COP facilitates. Also at COP27, $230 million were committed to the existing adaptation fund. This fund has allocated $998 million to climate adaptation activities, protecting or restoring 609,000 hectares of natural habitats, reducing flood risks, protecting beaches from erosion and more, and benefiting an estimated 38 million people. These are real positive changes that improve people's lives and combat the effects and severity of climate change, and they're supported by the COP process. Furthermore, COP provides an opportunity for bilateral and multilateral deals to be made on the global stage, and often this is where the real money is. South Africa was the first of the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, and it's benefiting from a deal worth $8.5 billion in favourable loans and grants to help it move away from coal and towards renewables. As of 2022, the first coal power station in South Africa has reached the end of its life, and due to market conditions created by the JET deal financing, it has been transformed into a renewable energy park. As part of this scheme, workers on the coal plant will be offered training and jobs in the construction of the new renewable energy park, ensuring a fair move away from coal that will benefit local communities and make Thatcher turn in her grave. Since then, Indonesia has signed a similar deal worth 20 billion and Vietnam a deal worth 15.5 billion, two significant economies with large populations, moving away from coal and fossil fuels because of financing supported by the COP process. So to summarise, we've heard how COPs drives consensus between parties with significant ideological differences. We've heard how COP can result in international agreements and treaties and how it can provide funding to meet the aims of these treaties. Without trying to preempt the other side's arguments, I'm sure that we're about to hear some of the flaws in the COP process. I can speak for the rest of the team when I say we're not pretending COP is perfect. It can be frustratingly slow and the funds raised are often insufficient. That, however, doesn't mean that the process isn't effective. It is having a tangible impact. And most importantly, there's no feasible alternative. The alternative to COP is not some fantastic arrangement where countries collaborate to solve climate change yesterday. The alternative is less collaboration, less action, less funds, and more emissions. That's why COP is not just an effective, but an essential form of climate action. I think that's it for our side. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Nathan, and thanks panel one. That was very excellent. Some great points raised there and some really helpful examples of where actions have been driven by the COP process. Thank you very much. Can I just remind you to please add any questions for the panelists to the Q&A on Slido. So you can find that by going to the Slido app, and then there should be a blue band with two titles there. One is the polls section, which there is nothing active at the moment, and there's also a Q&A section there where you can type any questions. Again, just a quick reminder to let us know who the question is for, or at least the panel that it's for would be really helpful so that we can make sure it gets to the right person. If you could add something in there, that would be great. Okay, let's move on to panel 2. So panel 2 are arguing that COP meetings are not an effective way of achieving climate action. Over to you and another Jess. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. Hi everyone, my name is Jessica and I'm a hydrologist at Mott MacDonald. The Conference of the Parties, hereafter referred to as COP, are vital global events that serve as a forum for decision making to achieve the targets laid out in the Paris Agreement on climate change. However, climate change remains a global issue. The world is not on track to limit warming to the lower than the 1.5 degree target. Just 3% of global policies are currently on track to meet this target. As such, I will be arguing that COP is not effective in delivering climate action, and I will be focusing on its ability to implement effective economic incentives and sufficient climate finance. So the provision of climate finance is one of the most important ways that we as a society can adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change. With worsening climate impacts, costs are estimated to be between $447 and $894 billion annually by 2030, and between $1.7 and $2.6 trillion annually by 2050 in developing countries alone. The establishment of a loss and damage fund at the last COP was for many the highlight of COP27 and the culmination of decades of pressure from climate vulnerable developing countries. The fund aims to mobilize $100 billion in climate finance from developed countries per year by 2020 to support climate adaptation in developing nations. One of the biggest challenges facing the Loss and Damage Fund was how do we raise the climate finance additional to that existing $100 billion per year commitment? In 2020, wealthy nations had only mobilized about $82 billion of the $100 billion promised. That target has been missed every year since 2013, and two of the world's biggest emitters, India and China, have actually pulled out of the agreement altogether. As a result, trust between countries has completely disappeared. Secondly, at present, only approximately 10% of climate finance reaches local communities, and most governments of developing countries do not themselves know how much is reaching the local communities. COP needs to address this disconnect. Enabling communities to directly access the loss and damage finance raised by COP and determine how to prioritize that funding will result in a more equitable approach for addressing loss and damage. Because loss and damage, especially the non-economic loss and damage, such as loss of culture, language, spiritual sites, education, and opportunity, is so personal and context-specific, putting self-determination at the center of financial decision-making is critical. A further challenge of the Loss and Damage Fund is that COP has not defined who, how much, and to whom the terms at which the public and private entities should be providing this climate finance. Traditionally, finance has been provided by public entities like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as non-concessional funds, which are generally more difficult for developing countries to repay due to the conditions associated with them, such as high interest rates on loan repayments. The private sector could play a pivotal role in accelerating global decarbonisation through setting science-based targets to reduce emissions within their operations and value chains. COP must set ambitious targets for the private sector to facilitate this innovation and set strong economic incentives for developed countries to contribute larger financial sums to help developing nations adapt to climate change. So how can we ensure that this Loss and Damage Fund remains effective in COP? We need concrete action on the climate finance delivery plan proposed in COP26. We need to hit that $100 billion US target. We need to increase climate finance provision across the board, especially for adaptation, and prioritize grant funding rather than loan provision for the poorer and most vulnerable countries, and address barriers to accessing finance, particularly those vulnerable communities at the local and grassroots level, which traditionally finance just doesn't reach. The world urgently needs to find more resources for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, so that climate change will not erode humanity's chances to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. So to date, provision for climate finance to developing countries via COP has been slow and insufficient to effectively adapt to the changing climate. In order for effective climate mitigation to occur, developed countries must contribute to the Loss and Damage Fund. Prioritizing grants and highly concessional finance to carry out adaptation activities is essential. This must be at the heart of the upcoming COP28 negotiations, as money needs to be set aside for adaptation mechanisms, accelerating the green economy in developing countries. Only then will the world be able to adapt effectively to the inevitable impacts of climate change. I'll now pass on to Sadiye, who will discuss the social imbalance and exclusion of key groups at COP.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm compelled to mention these key groups that have been excluded. In 2022, Pakistan encountered the worst kind of flood that's been known to the province, affecting over 9 million people, devastating over 1.7 million hectares of agricultural land and livestock. And as research shows, of this 9 million people that were affected, 80% of these groups were from the rural area. In the recent COP27 meeting, an agreement was reached, and it was called the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. And yet, if you have a look at that plan, you'll notice that very little mention is made of rural areas. It mentions vulnerable communities. Is it enough for us to simply say vulnerable communities? Because what do we mean by vulnerable communities? Are we speaking about children? Are we speaking about women? Are we speaking about men? It's a vague term. And so we strongly feel that COP needs to identify who these groups are. It's not enough to have people from think tanks, people from different organizations, NGOs, as people who represent groups. We want people who are from rural areas. Why are rural areas the focus of our discussion today? Because, well, of the 8 billion people that live on Earth today, 3.4 million are from rural areas. It's also been found that rural areas are the most impacted by global change, by global climate change. And so by leaving out rural areas in the fight against climate change, then there's a shortfall in finding the right solution. In defining vulnerable communities, we focus more on rural areas because, well, you'll find that a lot of the businesses that run in rural areas are run by women. And in fact, women are disproportionately impacted by climate crisis more than men and other groups. Well, you'll find that 7 out of 10 businesses that are run in rural areas are run by women. You'll also further find that a lot of the exposure to fossil fuels through cooking, through business running, is towards women. Women are the ones who are most exposed to these harmful fossil fuels. And in fact, research further shows that this has been shown to cause miscarriages and stillbirths. And so with such devastating results and research, we wonder, why is it that these key groups do not have a separate fund that is geared towards specific labeled groups to meet these targets towards climate change? Jessica mentioned, who is one of our, who's debating for COP, she mentioned that there was 110 world leaders who were represented at the COP summit, and this is true. What she did not mention, though, is that of the 110 leaders that were there, only 7 were women. This is perhaps, as Nathan aptly showed, the largest meeting, the largest gathering collaboration where treaties, implementation plans are drafted, negotiations are made, money is put on the table, commitments that will affect the entire planet are made, and only 7 women were present at these negotiations. And so if you have odds that are that meager, how much of the interests of women are actually at these meetings? Very few. There's a lot that can be said, and we do not turn a blind eye on the commitments that have been made by the COP. In 2021 at COP26, the Glasgow agreement was made, and it put forth 8.5 billion. This is in response to Nathan's point, and it's a great point that 8.5 billion was put forth towards South Africa's energy transition towards a greener energy source. This is interesting because this was also coupled by the fund that was put forth last year called the Loss and Damage Fund. Is it enough, I ask, that we have a loss and damage fund towards communities in Asia, Africa, that are most affected by this, when we know for a fact that it is not just the loss and the damage that affects these economies? For example, 8.5 billion was put forth towards South Africa's transition to green energy. And yet, as it stands, over 75% of the energy suppliers in South Africa are unable to meet the current demand. And this is simply because the infrastructure is aged and there isn't enough resources to be able to supply the demand. And so it's not enough to just focus on loss and damage. What's important, what is key, is being able to retrace and provide funding that is geared towards, firstly, repair. Unfortunately, it is not enough to start from this point and move forward. We have to retrace our steps and look back and recognize that the social imbalances that have impacted infrastructure, that have impacted people's lives, do not start today. And we cannot just simply put forth a fund that starts us today and into the future. We need a fund that will also retrace the steps and provide a repair fund, a repair work. That'll help us, that'll help Africa, Asia, as well as other disparaged communities that have impacted from well-developed countries that historically have been the countries that have impacted and contributed the most to climate change, to recognize that they need to put forth enough efforts towards providing and bridging the gap so that everyone is on a level field, and that when we implement green technologies, it can be equitably distributed throughout. And so in conclusion, the point that we mostly want to specify is that can the grants and the fundings that are put forth at COP be those that recognize and specifically label the key groups, and that there's a separate fund for each of these groups and not just an umbrella fund that can be misused and incorrectly allocated. And now I'll let Alice sum up. Thank you.
Thanks, Adair. So alongside the limitations outlined by Jess and Zia, I will quickly argue that COP is ineffective at delivering climate action due to the lack of transparent and consistent leadership and its consequent inability to create cohesive global movements. So when we look at COP, each year the president COP is presided over by different countries, and a nominated leader is given by that country. So a hot topic of debate for COP28 is that the appointment of Sultan Al Jaber as the president, and Al Jaber is the head of ADNOC, which is a state-owned oil giant and one of the world's largest oil companies. So this is a clear conflict of interest, and there's growing backlash against this appointment, with some arguing it's like putting the tobacco industry in charge of ending smoking. Another notable limitation of COP leadership dynamics is the rotation of presidency. And so the rotation results in a lack of continuity and long-term vision. And each year the priorities of the presidency shift. So when we look at COP26, there is an explicit plan to reduce the use of coal, while COP27 in Egypt saw that more influence from oil and gas producing nations due to the conflict in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis. So this leadership results in discontinuity and dysfunctionality. When we're looking more at geopolitical maneuvering impacting the debate around managing our climate, there's some limitations there as well. So when we look at the summit bringing together different negotiators, business people, civil groups around the world, there's different individual agendas that appear to get in the way, and this is reducing the effectiveness of COP negotiations. Furthermore, the global timetable is obviously very busy for member countries in terms of current affairs, both domestic and internationally. So when there's an event where leaders cannot attend or attention is diverted in the media, this also removes the effectiveness of the COP. So to quickly summarize, climate experts are calling for to restore the systemic inefficiency of COP and suggest a separate standing of departments focusing on, for example, energy, transport, deforestation, etc., that work all year round, as opposed to a bloated festival of world leader photo shoots and oil executives. In conclusion, the lack of financial incentives, social imbalances, opaque leadership, and wider global priorities have resulted in the absence of real progress and implementation of climate commitments, let alone the diminishment of trust that COP is effective at delivering climate action. So we're looking forward to looking at the second vote, and back to you, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, panel two. That was also really, really good. Some excellent points there made. Really helpful examples to reinforce their points as well. So we are going to move now on to the second vote. Please keep continuing to add your questions to the Q&A on Slido. So while you are voting, you can pop in a question there if you have one into the Q&A section on Slido too. If you want to should we go live now to the Slido vote? Wow, the first, oh, okay, we only have 4 people in, so. Please keep voting, we've got 17 people there. I'll give you a few minutes on that. Remember, please, to add any questions you have to the Q&A. We have got some time after this vote on the Q&A section, so please feel free to add your thoughts. What I will do is I will take the questions that have been most liked. So if you do want to pop in there and just see which questions you would like to be asked first, then pop a little like next to it and I'll know which are the most popular questions to ask. Okay, looking at this now, we've probably got about half the votes that we had the first time round. So if people could continue to place their votes, it is still very close to the first vote. Okay, let's go to the Q&A now while we're just finalising that vote, and maybe that will help you guys to make your minds up on some things, because we haven't quite got as many people who voted first time round on the second vote. So let's go to the Q&A first. So the most liked question is, so for the first team, so panel 1, who are arguing for COP achieving climate action. There's a comment here, for the first team who admitted COP is not the perfect solution, but still effective, do you think there are easy ways it could be made more effective? Anyone from panel 1 have any thoughts on that question?
I'm happy to say something.
You,
So I think we've kind of acknowledged that COP kind of comes up with these agreements that are really good. They sound really good, and they're really like good ways to drive climate action. But what we've seen is that, like with the loss and damage fund, it's a really good idea, but how is that actually going to happen kind of in reality? So one way to kind of like make it more effective would just be to have like a bigger focus on, like, once we've got the agreement, how are we actually going to like put that fund kind of in place to make sure that it is seen like on the ground.
And I'd also add to that, kind of, I think it was Sadir who mentioned that much of the funding is in the form of loans or concessional loans. And I'd agree that there needs to be much more of an emphasis on grants from developed or richer nations, such as the UK, because we owe these countries a debt for our historical emissions, and we can't prevent them from sort of achieving prosperity because they're busy paying back loans or adapting to climate change. So I think there needs to be much more of an emphasis on grant funding, and it's perhaps an onus on us in the UK to vote for politicians who will do that and will give in the form of aid as opposed to loans.
Thanks, Nathan. Thank you. So, oh.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry. So for the next liked question, for the anti-COP team, what can COP do to create a more equal gender representation if the majority of the nation's elected leaders are men? That's actually posed to the anti-COP team, but if there's someone from the pro-COP team that want to answer that, that's also fine.
Alice, are you taking this one? Because I took a bit of your time.
Oh no, I was actually thinking it relates more to your argument.
Okay.
If you had any thoughts.
Yeah, so a greater function of COP in our view really is understanding the fundamental issues that the climate has and impacts on communities, as well as the fundamental issues that have led to climate change. And so we have to start with the SDGs, we have to start with everything, and it's important to have women leaders. So for instance, in the invites, you could be the leader, but maybe there could be a law or a quota that instructs and directs and gives guidance that they will only possibly have a representative that is a woman, and that'll motivate the leaders to ensure that there's a woman within the higher up levels. But if there's no law that says, because we know, for instance, that even in the workplace, if there weren't quotas that instruct for the appointment of women, we wouldn't have women in leadership. And so COP shouldn't be any different. It's incumbent on the policies that are set forth in COP to insist on there being women representations at these meetings. And in fact, votes shouldn't be passed or negotiations shouldn't be passed if that's not the case. And that really shows that we understand the fundamental societal issues that have led to climate change at that and the impacts that it has on the greater community, I'd say.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Next question. For the anti-team, who agrees that climate change is an issue? I think we all do, hopefully, on this call here today and as part of this group. What is the replacement solution if COP is dissolved? What will keep countries on target? Do you have any thoughts on what an alternative could be to the COP meeting?
Yeah, it's so that question, it's really interesting. And I think I was stemming on at the end of my argument there about different parties working throughout the year. And I understand that COP is an excellent way to create global cohesion. It was quite hard arguing against that. But it's about implementing action. And I think one of the fundamental parts of doing that is being able to look at the science and having a review of that all year round, because there's constantly new science out there, and being able to work on that as soon as that's available is really important, I feel. I'm not sure what structure that would be, but I see the different departments working annually as a potential way forward.
Thanks, Alice. That's helpful. That's good. Good answer. I think we're running out of time a little bit, so I think we're just gonna hop to the Slido now and see where everyone is at on their opinions. We're still a little under, so if anyone, last chance now in 1 more minute, just to get your thoughts in. At the moment, we're still extremely close to the previous on the first vote, which was 67% on no's and 33% on the yes. So from this current vote here, it does look like the people who are arguing that yes, it is effective have increased by 1% the decision. So it's not easy to change hearts and minds. It certainly wasn't on the last debate. So it kind of stayed pretty much exactly the same on the last one as well. So a 1% swing is a win, I guess. I think that is now closed. There's no one else, so we'll call that a 66-34%. So a 1% swing from the fours. Well done. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that has been involved in the debate. My name is Emma Moses. I work for Royal Haskell DHV, and I've been your host today. The panelists have put lots of time and effort into kind of putting together this debate and have done a really excellent job. There'll be more interesting debates and discussions from the CIWEM Early Careers Network and the CIWEM Climate Change Specialist panel coming out shortly. The next one is on whether disruptive eco-activism is effective or not. If you're an early career professional and you would like to, or you're interested in speaking at the next event, please get in touch with Miles Woodruff. His email address should hopefully be in the chat now so that you can use that to get hold of Miles. If you want to sign up to the next event just to join as you have done today, please do that on the CIWEM events page to sign up for the next debate. As I said, that will be on disruptive eco-activism and whether it's effective or not. Thank you to the organisers here as well and the technical support from the CIWEM team. It's been really useful, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. It's been a really, really helpful, interesting debate. So thanks very much for your time.